Do you consider it an invasion of privacy if your partner checks your phone? In medieval castles, suspicion of infidelity meant that your nose would be cut off in the town square, while your neighbors made bets on how long you'd scream. I'm talking about real punishments that make Game of Thrones look like a children's fairy tale. For centuries, the stone walls of the grandest castles in Europe witnessed horrors specifically designed to destroy women accused of infidelity. The punishments were so intricate, so public, and so permanently disfiguring that death would have been a more merciful option. Today, we walk through the corridors of castles that most history books conveniently skip over. The question is not whether these punishments happened, but how anyone could survive them. Before we dive into this nightmare, do something for me. If you believe history is not just about dates and dead kings, but the harsh, uncomfortable, and utterly brutal truth of human existence, hit the like button. Subscribe because we're not just listing facts. We're uncovering things you weren't told in school. Leave a comment. Tell me where you're watching this from, and if you think you could survive medieval justice. Now, let's descend into the darkest punishment chambers of castles. The bridle for quarrelsome women, the silence of shame. Let's start with something that looks almost picturesque in museum displays, until you understand how it actually worked. The bridle was a metal cage that enclosed a woman's head. But here's what you won't see in the exhibits. Most versions had a 5-centimeter-long iron spike that pressed the tongue down. In Walton-on-Thames, England, in 1567, Margaret Davy suffered for 3 days after her husband accused her of entertaining a merchant. Every time she tried to speak, beg, or even swallow, the spike inflicted new wounds on her tongue. Imagine a metal cage locked around your head. You can't eat. Your jaw can't open wide enough. You can't drink without choking on your own blood. You can't explain that your husband's accusations are lies. What's worse is that this wasn't happening in private. Margaret was paraded through the village, with bells attached to her bridle, ringing with each forced step, announcing her shame to every baker, blacksmith, and old friend. The Chronicle of Shrewsbury describes a woman who wore the bridle for 6 days in 1590. When it was finally removed, she bit off part of her own tongue while trying to avoid the spike. The message from medieval society was clear as day. The first thing that needed to be destroyed was a woman's voice. If you couldn't defend yourself, you couldn't preserve your innocence. Let's move up a level because it seems that metal tortures were just the warm-up. When Lady Eleanor de Clare was accused of adultery in 1321 at Carew Castle in Wales, her punishment began with what seems almost simple. They shaved her head completely, but they didn't stop there. They shaved every last hair off her body. In the grand hall of the castle, in front of assembled courtiers, servants, and honored guests, Eleanor was stripped and shaved by the castle's servants, while her husband sat and ate pheasant. Her eyebrows vanished. Hair that had grown for years, reaching down to her waist to emphasize her status, disappeared. And then came the real punishment. She was ordered to walk along the castle walls, completely bald and naked, for 3 days in the midst of February's cold. You have to understand what hair meant for women in the Middle Ages. It wasn't just fashion. It was identity, status, femininity itself. Being publicly shaved meant being marked as something less than human. It's like having your face permanently tagged on social media with the label unfaithful, and everyone you meet will see the evidence grow back. Monastic chronicles record at least 47 cases of noblewomen receiving this punishment in England and France between the years 1300 and 1450. These women had to live in the same castles, eat in the same halls, meet the same people who had witnessed their humiliation every day, waiting for months while their hair grew back. Your disgraceful mark became your permanent face. A story from Kenilworth Castle describes Alice Perrers, who, after being shaved in 1337, refused to leave her chambers for 8 months. When she finally emerged, her hair had regrown, but it had turned white when she was only 29 years old. The ducking stool, drowning in shame. Picture this: a wooden chair attached to a long beam, positioned over a castle moat. Sounds almost like a fairground attraction, right? Now imagine you're strapped to this chair, your hands tied behind your back, and you're repeatedly dunked into water polluted with sewage and ice cold, while the whole town gathers to watch and mock. In 1445 at Leith Castle, Joan Williamson endured 17 dunkings into the moat for alleged adultery. Castle household records describe how each dunking lasted until she could no longer hold her breath after the previous submersion. The water in the moat wasn't exactly clean. We're talking about sewage, dead animals, and any diseases that could fester in this stagnant water. The real cruelty of this punishment lay in its design. It was meant to be survivable. Barely. If you drowned, God had deemed you guilty. If you survived, you were still considered guilty. But now, you had the privilege of living with a respiratory disease that would likely kill you within 3 months. City records from Chester show that about 60% of women who underwent repeated dunkings developed water fever, likely pneumonia or sepsis. And because medieval people had a twisted sense of efficiency, they often combined punishments. First, the shaving, of course. Now let's dunk you in icy water without the hair that could protect your scalp from hypothermia. And here's the moment that truly reflects the cruelty of the time. This was considered the light punishment. Seriously, some women of the nobility preferred the ducking stool over what would come next. Excruciating disfigurements. This is permanent. Now, we enter the territory that's truly hard to talk about. When Agnes de Bézicy was convicted of adultery at Alnwick Castle in 1296, they cut off her nose, not metaphorically, but completely, by burning it with a hot knife that scorched while it sliced. And this was a countess. If such things happened to noblewomen, imagine what happened to commoners. The Chronicles of Nercosta document a case from 1317 when the wife of a feudal lord at Carley Castle, known only as Maria Carley, was caught with a knight in her house. The punishment was precise. They cut off her nose and both her ears. The barber surgeon of the castle carried out the disfigurement in the courtyard, using scissors heated in the forge. Maria survived, but her life was effectively over. No veil could hide the damage. Anyone who looked at her knew exactly what she'd been accused of. Why the nose? Why the ears? Because medieval society was obsessed with external signs of internal sin. It was believed that your face reflected your soul. The immutability of the disfigurements left a permanent mark that screamed, "Traitor, unfaithful, unworthy," to everyone you met. It was social death without the mercy of physical death. You couldn't hide it. No excuses. Documents from Durham Castle list 14 women who were disfigured for adultery between 1290 and 1340. 14 women whose faces were systematically destroyed to set an example. But what's even more horrific is that in most cases, there was no trial, no evidence, no defense. A husband's accusation was enough. Bricking into the wall, being buried alive in the walls of the castle. Take a deep breath, because this is a real nightmare story. Being bricked into a wall or tower was a punishment for the most serious cases of adultery. When Countess Catherine de Tir was convicted of infidelity at her husband's castle in Brittany in 1378, she was bricked up alive in a small chamber in the northern tower. The room was only 2 by 2 meters. She was given a Bible, a candle, and a small hole through which food and water were passed to her, with no windows, no light, and no human contact except the silent hand that passed her bread twice a day through the hole. Catherine lived in this grave, imagine that, hour by hour, in complete darkness, touching the same stone walls, in silence so complete you'd hear your own heartbeat like war drums. Medieval chronicles describe women locked in walls who went completely mad, screaming at the stones, talking to hallucinated companions. Some stopped eating, preferring to starve rather than spend another day in the dark. Ruins of Rusin Castle on the Isle of Man contain a locked chamber in its northwest tower. In 1938, during renovations, workers broke open the wall and found human skeletal remains. The woman still wore decayed 14th-century clothing. Her hands were worn to the bone from scraping at the walls. The stone had scratches as deep as 8 centimeters in some places. This wasn't execution. It was a drawn-out torture over many years. And the most twisted part is that this was considered mercy because technically you weren't executed. The church condemned the execution of noble women. Their souls needed saving. So instead, you were given decades to reflect on your sins in a stone tomb which would ultimately kill you anyway. The death of reputation. Psychological destruction. Let's talk about punishment that didn't leave physical scars, but destroyed women just as effectively. The procession of shame. In 1425, Lady Margaret Stafford from Stafford Castle was accused of an affair with her husband's squire. Her punishment was to walk from the castle to the village church, nearly 3 kilometers, naked, wearing only a thin nightgown, barefoot in January, holding a candle, and publicly confessing her sin at every corner. But here's what made this punishment especially cruel. She had to do it every Sunday for 6 months, 24 walks of shame, 24 times standing at the crossroads, declaring, "I betrayed my husband and God 24 times." Enduring the humiliation of having children throw dirt at her, adults spit on her, and old friends turn away. The punishment wasn't in the cold or the stones that cut into her feet, but in how her entire social circle systematically rejected her week after week. The records of Bishop Gray describe these processions in several villages in England. Women carried lit candles, and if the candle went out due to wind, trembling hands, or the body failing to endure, the procession would start over. It is reported that one woman in York fainted 3 times in one walk. Each time, she was revived and forced to continue. Medieval society understood something we've almost forgotten. Social death can be worse than physical death. If you take someone's reputation, their community, their dignity, you destroy them much more than any executioner. These women lived, breathed, ate, existed, but they were ghosts. And this was the psychological trap. You couldn't defend yourself. Any resistance meant that the punishment would escalate into something physical. Now imagine that marriage in the Middle Ages was not just an act of love, but a crucial political step. Sometimes it was far more important than personal feelings. Women entered into marriages to strengthen political alliances, and their children could become heirs to thrones and lands. Women were at the center of a vast political game, and their role in shaping the state was often underestimated. However, not everything was so simple and beautiful. If you think the lives of women were exclusively centered in the halls of palaces, think again. Many women from peasant families worked alongside men. They not only took care of the household, but also managed agriculture, worked in the fields, practiced crafts, and even sold their goods at markets. But despite all the hardships, they remained an integral part of society. Medieval women also had a significant impact on the arts. Fabrics, embroidery, books, music, all of this was part of their world. They created, inspired, and preserved culture for future generations. Ladies at court became patrons of the arts, commissioning paintings and sculptures, which contributed to the cultural development of that time. Who were the women of the Middle Ages? So, women in the Middle Ages were not just figures in the background, as often portrayed in history. They actively participated in society, politics, culture, and economics. Women managed lands, studied in monasteries, supported knights, and fought for their rights. The history that is often hidden reveals the real stories of strong and determined women. Do you think these women could have changed the history of their time if they had been given more freedom? Share your thoughts in the comments, And don't forget to subscribe to the channel if you're interested in learning more about how medieval ladies influenced the development of Europe.